Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Intentional Neuroplasticity, Moving Our Nervous Systems and Educational System Toward Post-Traumatic Growth, by Lori L. Desautels, Ph.D., narrated by Jennifer Aquino. Foreword. A Paradigm Shift in Education. On September 21, 2019, I presented the keynote at the 2019 Educational Neuroscience Symposium at Butler University. The symposium was a highlight of an innovative program developed by Dr. Desautels to introduce neuroscience to educators. As a prelude to the symposia, Lori invited me to discuss polyvagal theory with her graduate students through an interactive Zoom dialogue. As a laboratory-oriented scientist, it was a challenge for me to translate concepts from the polyvagal theory into a language that mapped into the issues that educators faced in their classrooms. The discussion with her and her students introduced me to aspects of the unique portal she was developing to embed neuroscience into the training of her graduate students that would enrich and expand their perspective of the educational experience. In retrospect, I have always been engaged in exploring the educational process. Of course, as a professor for more than 5 decades, teaching, mentorship, and lifelong learning have always been the focus of my personal experiences. However, my personal link with the educational process goes back to my childhood. My parents both had experiences as classroom teachers, and my father later became a school administrator. As my academic career developed, in 1985, I shifted institutions and moved from being a professor of psychology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, to a professor of human development at the University of Maryland, College Park. Unlike my position at the University of Illinois, the Department of Human Development at the University of Maryland was administratively within the College of Education, and early childhood education resided within the department. Later at the University of Maryland, I would chair the department and direct the Institute for Child Study, which contained the preschool. Exposure to the teacher training curricula from the various departments within the college provided me with insight into how educators conceptualized the behavior of children. In general, behaviors of school-aged children were viewed as intentional and independent of age. The courses in the teacher training curricula treated child behavior as manipulatable through the traditional principles of learning, such as rewards and punishments. Even in the realm of developmental disabilities, there was little acknowledgement of neurobiological contributions due to maturation or to the observed individual differences among students. For many faculty and their students, behavior modification procedures were the primary tools for managing atypical, less desirable, or disruptive behaviors. I quickly realized that the educational curricula within the entire college had a strong behavioral orientation, virtually devoid of any understanding of potential biological contributions to variations in behavior, especially behaviors that disrupt classroom activity, which have often become pathologized. For example, ADD, oppositional. As I developed my courses, I distilled a modest goal of embedding 2 biologically based principles into teacher training curricula. First, I realized that although children were the target populations for teachers, teacher training did not provide a strong foundation for understanding the maturational trajectories of the brain and nervous system. Since the status of the brain and nervous system are important neuroanatomical foundations for learning, then an understanding of these structures, their relation to learning and behavior, and their developmental trajectory should be important to teachers and should influence teaching strategy and content. Second, there seemed to be a lack of interest in individual differences, especially in terms of behavioral state regulation. Both these important biological variations were masked with assessments of productivity, usually indexed by relatively simple outcome metrics of vocabulary, memorization of facts, and math skills. As a department chair within a college of education, I approached this void by attempting to hire faculty with strong biological orientations and an interest in the nervous system. Although I was able to hire strong faculty in the cognitive sciences, I was not successful in recruiting faculty who were committed to a new educational neuroscience, an area that is successfully being pioneered by Dr. Desautels and highlighted by the current volume, Intentional Neuroplasticity. While I was a faculty member in a college of education, there were several faculty members across departments who had an interest in how the nervous system's contribution to child behavior could be leveraged in developing educational strategies. However, their interests were not supported by their academic background or passion to develop a program through the lens of a classroom teacher. Lori is a personification of this vision, which ironically, while being firmly based on science, leads to the treatment of students and their parents, as well as teachers and staff, with greater compassion. Lori would have been the dream candidate for the program I had envisioned. Not only does she understand neuroscience principles, but by having a classroom teacher perspective, she can, as she has done in this volume, effectively communicate with educators. Without a colleague like Lori, my interests in the neurobiology of development and developmental disabilities motivated me to move in 2001 to the University of Illinois College of Medicine, where I created and directed the Brain Body Center in the Department of Psychiatry. We learned from Lori's work that the principles of neuroscience, and especially the polyvagal theory, fit our intuitions and explain the gut and heartfelt feelings that we, as well as our students, colleagues, friends, and family have. By appreciating the nervous system as a dynamically adjusting platform of behaviors and feelings, we treat students as living organisms with an instinctual motivation to survive and to seek safety. Once we see this vision, our responsibilities shift to finding effective portals of engagement and connectedness that will calm the nervous system and mitigate defensive physiological states that become behaviorally expressed as aggression, opposition, anxiety, and even social withdrawal and depression. My experiences within a college of education taught me specific lessons. Initially, I was informed about the differences in the objectives and missions between colleges of education and colleges of liberal arts and sciences. Colleges of education are professional schools with a focused agenda of producing classroom teachers, that is, K through 12. In contrast, colleges of liberal arts and sciences are focused on the accumulation of knowledge within a discipline. Graduation from these schools result in different and contrasting products. For example, the teaching objectives and strategies are quite different for a college professor within an arts and sciences department when compared to an elementary school teacher. The professor's primary teaching role is that of mentorship to a few select graduate students who are being motivated to be passionately driven by their curiosity to discover new information that optimistically will lead to them becoming independent scholars. Many will continue their scholarship post-graduation and become professors themselves, replicating the process with their graduate students. In contrast, the K-12 school teacher has a set of goals for the students and needs to be trained to deliver and evaluate a relatively fixed curriculum. In 2019, when Lori invited me to participate in the Educational Neuroscience Symposium at Butler University, I was intrigued with the concept of moving neuroscience into the training of educators. However, based on my own experiences, I was cautious about the outcome of such a program. One of the lessons I learned was that coming from the classroom is helpful in developing and implementing teacher education. When I was a faculty member in a college of education, there was internal pressure from the dean's office to hire faculty who had experience teaching K-12. Being a laboratory-focused scientist, I did not agree with this bias. However, as I have watched Lori's presentations and read Intentional Neuroplasticity, I now have a better appreciation of the importance of the teacher's viewpoint in integrating a polyvagal-informed or a more general neuroscience perspective that can enhance the educational process and may seamlessly be integrated into educational systems. When I talked at the 2019 Educational Neuroscience Symposium, I boldly challenged the attendees by asking two questions. 1. How would your classroom experience be if there were no behavioral state regulation difficulties in your classroom? 2. How much of your training was dedicated to understanding and developing techniques to mitigate behavioral state regulation problems? The answers to these questions were obvious to the attendees. If behavioral state regulation difficulties were not a problem, then students would more efficiently and effectively learn. The classroom experiences for students would change if there were an appreciation that their behaviors were not solely determined by intention. A neuroscience-informed educational model incorporates the profound and potent role that the physiological state has in mediating behavior. It also highlights the portals through which the physiological state can be monitored, such as voice, facial expression, posture, and muscle tone. Teachers will learn that not only do their students broadcast whether their physiological states are calm and welcoming or reacting to threat, but that they themselves are part of the communication loop, either co-regulating and calming or disrupting and triggering physiological threat reactions that are broadcast as fear or anger and felt in our bodies. The products of this paradigm shift would lead to the defensive behaviors expressed in the classroom being managed in a more polyvagal informed and compassionate manner. The results would provide opportunities for children to benefit from being in a calmer physiological state that would support sociality, learning, enjoyment, and even physical health. Intentional neuroplasticity is packed with accessible information to answer these questions and to change classroom teaching. Through the work of Dr. Desautels, educators now have information to understand the potent role of the physiological state in mediating the behaviors of their students, colleagues, and themselves. This knowledge can shift the paradigm in education and lead to schools becoming more effective, welcoming, and enjoyable. Stephen W. Porges, Ph.D., Distinguished University Scientist, Founding Director, Traumatic Stress Research Consortium, Kinsey Institute, Indiana University Bloomington, Professor of Psychiatry, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prologue. When I was little, I was always observing and intensely curious about how people interacted with each other by moving through so many emotional states each day. I wondered how human beings could physically, emotionally, or verbally hurt one another, and yet hours, days, or weeks later, or within other relationships, feel a sense of compassion and collaboration with such steadfast loyalty. I also wondered how I could feel such strong anger or jealousy toward my closest friends one day, and then the next day, laugh, hug, and plan secret adventures with these same friends. Why can't some people rejoice when wonderful things happen for their friends or families? Why do we sometimes feel such resentment for those we care about? Why is there felt divisiveness and competition between people, among communities, and inside schools, districts, and organizations? What drives people to feel such strong, blistering anger towards someone and then deeply feel a sense of safety and connection with someone else? At age 10, I did not know or understand that the human nervous system is not only neurologically wired to survive and protect, but also that human beings are neurologically wired for connection, prioritizing attachment above everything else. Without attachment, we cannot survive. We not only need one another, we also begin to restore and heal from embodied emotional pain when we feel seen and heard, metabolizing the challenging and traumatic experiences that can keep us locked into survival nervous system states of fight, flight, and shutdown. The physiology of the brain is impacted by trauma, but the physiology of relational connection can mitigate the felt brokenness and disconnect from our earlier or ongoing adversities and trauma. We are creatures of attachment, and our endorphins, our internal opiate chemicals, facilitate attachment. This book explores the plasticity of our individual and collective nervous systems and how our sensations, feelings, thoughts, perceptions, and behaviors can change structurally and functionally through our internal, environmental, and relational experiences with others. Just as our bodies digest the food we eat, they digest our lived experiences too. Intergenerational trauma can be explained by how our families receive and digest past generational embodied experiences. Our perceptions of what feels threatening or unsafe might have evolved from a highly sensitized and activated nervous system, and that reactive state can eventually become our new normal. This sensitized nervous system developed during states of protection that continuously detect cues of threat from the environment and from the people around us, cues based upon past experiences and relationships. Ordinary moments can begin to feel unsafe and threatening if we become triggered or activated by fragments of experiences that remind us of those terrifying times, or by the accumulation of adversities that leave us feeling disconnected from the chronic unpredictability. These chapters are filled with stories, questions, applied research, and practices that have been germinating in my mind and heart for a lifetime. But this book has manifested in this time because of the brilliant and courageous educators and students whom I have had the privilege to sit beside and learn from each day as we move through the challenges and shifts that our schools, families, and communities have recently encountered and are encountering yet again as another school year is born. I am learning that growth and healing occur in the present time. We are learning how trauma impacts the developing brain and body as we now address how connection, resiliency, and growth are significant players in our healing and wholeness. Post-traumatic growth is present-time work. Introduction. Paradigm shifts do not happen overnight, but they can slowly and intentionally kindle a spark of hope when individuals reach out to one another, planting seeds of possibility through acts of kindness and grace. It has always been this way, as our capacity for love is far greater than the appendages of fear. I am always curious about the plasticity of my own nervous system. Acknowledging the state of my nervous system creates a starting point as I become aware of the sensations of unrest, anxious wavering, winds of panic, or worries that swirl like dried brown leaves, blowing around my feet on a cold afternoon. Introduction to Intentional Neuroplasticity. You had the power all along, my dear. L. Frank Baum, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. This book has been growing in my mind and heart throughout my life. As a young girl, I thought about all the ingredients or experiences that shift, sort, flow, become stuck, grow, wither away, and germinate to create the me that I am always becoming. Throughout my personal and professional life as a teacher, counselor, college professor, mom, and all roles that I have been honored to hold, I've noticed moments of streamlined thoughts and encouraging feelings that serve me well throughout a day. And then suddenly, there is a shift. I unconsciously revert to older practiced thoughts and feelings that are automatically activated in a surge of negative emotion. I find myself protecting and defending through my survival responses that rupture what was a former flow of pleasant and calming experiences. When this rupture occurs, negatively impacting moments, days, or longer periods of time, I am learning about the gift of awareness and the ability of my body and brain to refocus and begin again. It is so difficult. Reflecting on these embodied moments, it feels as if my brain has been constantly adjusting or changing to adapt to these constantly moving parts and conditions in ways that I often wasn't consciously aware of, but that I accepted anyway as I moved through challenging or joy-filled times. I remember the curiosity, apprehension, worry, or an overflowing sensation of anxiety when sensory experiences felt too much and too fast for my nervous system to process. As I write these opening words, I am plagued by the felt enormity of our nation's challenges and the present systemic conditions and inequities that are fueling such pain, hurt, racism, poverty, and violence in a world that feels to be in a persistent state of alarm. I hesitate, remembering that these huge communal swings begin with the individual, with me. Paradigm shifts do not happen overnight, but they can slowly and intentionally kindle a spark of hope when individuals reach out to one another, planting seeds of possibility through acts of kindness and grace. Paradigm shifts begin with questions. Questions move us into broader and novel spaces where we begin to think about options that elude us when we are focused on the challenges and perceived problems. Questions are capable of installing emotional and nurturing resources that we were not aware of before a challenging time or crisis. This book is filled with questions that I hope will begin to tap into the agency we uphold while supporting our strengths and imaginations. Although we are wired with a negative brain bias, our capacity for love is far greater than the appendages of fear and negativity. I am always curious about the plasticity of my own nervous system. Acknowledging the state of my nervous system creates a starting point as I become aware of the sensations of unrest, anxious wavering, winds of panic, or worries that swirl like dried brown leaves, blowing around my feet on a cold afternoon. Through our losses, celebrations, hardships, anxieties, worries, joys, and all lived experiences, our brains are in a lifelong process of change. At birth and even in utero, our brains are continually organizing, disorganizing, and reorganizing as they adapt to our external and internal worlds. We inherit the nervous systems of our mothers, and generational trauma can pounce upon us before we take our first breath. In 2021-2022, the educational system is deeply experiencing the effects from a third academic year moving through a pandemic. Educators are working with children and youth who are carrying their unrest, fatigue, and mental and emotional exhaustion into classrooms and schools. The educator fatigue and burnout is palpable. Once again, I return to consider the plasticity of my own nervous system. While I am unable to control the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of others, there is always plasticity in my responses. I am keenly aware that neuroplasticity can be the latest and greatest buzzword for advertisements, motivational speakers, businesses, and even educationalists. However, neuroplasticity is not the latest cure or fix or strategy. It is the complex reorganization of the nervous system from the lowest levels of molecular activity to the breadth and depth of the entire brain and body connection as it interacts with the world around us. I have never understood how educational practitioners are not deeply informed and encouraged to share this dynamic, miraculous superpower of human potentiality with children and youth in our schools. When children understand why they feel the way they do, or how feelings and thoughts impact their mood, motivation, and engagement, we empower and relieve these young nervous systems, preparing our children for a lifetime of possibility through the knowledge of brain and body architecture and plasticity. Just as trauma and adversity form painful implicit memories, experiences of warm, nurturing, safe relationships can provide a foundation of flourishing neural networks each time we revisit and experience our connections with others. These connections buffer and protect the felt adversity and trauma while planting seeds of developmental growth and possibility. The more we reach out to others who provide us with a sense of felt safety, the more we activate and strengthen these neural networks in our brains. Psychiatrist and author Dr. Norman Doidge defines neuroplasticity in this way. Neuroplasticity is the property of the brain that enables it to change its own structure and functioning in response to activity and mental experience. Neuroscientist Eric Kandel also demonstrated how all learning can turn on genes that change neural structure, while hundreds of studies followed, demonstrating that mental activity is not only the product of the brain, but also the shaper of it. We are learning that the brain is not where all the action resides. Our brains evolved millions of years after our bodies, and our brain and body are in constant communication, adapting to one another. Like the brain, the body contains neurons. Our gut alone holds approximately 100 million neurons. It is through the deep, fluid conversations between our bodies and brains that healing, resiliency, and growth can occur. This is the neuroplasticity of our nervous systems. Working together, our brains and bodies become partners in growth and healing. Indeed, the word heal comes from the Old English heilen, meaning to make whole. Dr. Lara Boyd, a neuroscientist from the University of British Columbia, writes her definition of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is supported by chemical, structural, and functional changes in the brain, and these are happening across the whole brain. They can occur in isolation from one another, but most often they take place in concert. Together, they support learning, and they're taking place all the time. How does this occur? Learning something new causes the brain to develop connections between brain cells, called neurons. With added connections, the neurons can send and receive more messages. These connections help to strengthen the regions that we are activating, and the brain responds more readily. With practice, we become more efficient or skilled, whether we are learning a new behavior, playing a sport, learning academic content, or acquiring a different feeling, thought, perception, or belief. Just 50 years ago, the idea that the adult brain could change was heretical. Researchers accepted that the young infant brain is malleable, but believed that it gradually hardens, becoming fixed and static, and that by 5 or 6 years of age, we are who we are forever. Today, we are learning how wrong the early research was. Our nervous systems evolved to change, enabling us to adapt to the environment and new experiences based on past experiences. Neuroplasticity is an intrinsic and fundamental property of all nervous systems. In our schools, the focus has traditionally explored the behaviors of students as the fixed target of focus and change. We are currently exploring and paying attention to the plasticity of the brain and nervous system, while learning how adversity and trauma impact the developing nervous system to affect behaviors and the way we approach discipline and engagement. In the Western parts of the world, we tend to be cognitive heavy. We think, reason, talk, lecture, and problem solve with words and logistics. Also, much like older, outdated medical models that fail to enlist the intelligence of the whole patient in his or her own care, schools unintentionally delete the intelligence of our bodies, which hold and carry the sensations, feelings, and patterns of perceptions that impact our behaviors and overall well-being. Hippocrates saw the body as the foundation of healing, with the expectation that physicians and patients would collaborate to help the body activate its own healing. With the growing body of research in relational and affective neuroscience, our schools can benefit and serve the whole student as we prioritize the nervous system by addressing the embodied experiences, generational and historical trauma, and the stories they hold. Our bodies keep the score by holding on to adversities and trauma we have encountered, and our minds sometimes hide the score of those adversities and trauma. This book is about growth through exploring mindsets, practices, and perspectives that cultivate and lean into radical well-being. This book embraces the framework of applied educational neuroscience, which addresses the brain and nervous system development through an educator's lens as we explore these 4 pillars: educator brain and body state, attachment/touch points, co-regulation, and teaching students and staff about their own neuroanatomy and nervous systems. These 4 pillars support a relational and nervous system-aligned discipline lens that addresses behaviors originating from nervous system function, the restorative power of relationships, and how our experiences begin to shape our sensations, feelings, and thoughts. As one young student said, "So I am not a bad kid? My brain is protecting me when I feel angry?" I am a teacher, not a neuroscientist, yet I know that the translations and applications from the affective, developmental, social, and relational neuroscience research are critical to educational practitioners now more than ever. We are moving through a 3rd pandemic school year with emotional and social challenges, adding to the existing individual and community adversities that are challenging the emotional and mental health of our youth. No one could have been.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?